With me now, Diane Abbott, a strong supporter of Jeremy Corbyn, who's Shadow International Development Secretary, and voting the other way, Dan Jarvis, MP, who has seen active service in both Afghanistan and Iraq. Diane Abbott, you are apparently, according to the Prime Minister's words last night in the 1922 committee, a terrorist sympathiser.
That's desperate stuff. He knows his argument's unravelling, so he's resorting to abuse. I'm a London MP. I remember 7/7. I spent hours frightened. I didn't know where my relatives were, whether they were caught up in it. I'm very far from a terrorist sympathiser.
And your principal point?
My principal point about these airstrikes, that they will not work, that they will not make British people safe, that what Cameron, these bogus battalions Cameron is talking about, will not be able to help with the air power. We know that the Americans have been bombing ISIS in Syria for a year, and ISIS is stronger. And, I think this is so tragic because I do not believe these airstrikes will work in the sense that Cameron claims, and I believe we're on the verge of being drawn into a land war in Syria, which will be a long war.
Dan Jarvis, you've been on the ground in a war. You've been in the wars in both Afghanistan and Iraq, as I said. Does it really make sense, the idea that 8 tornadoes are going to go in and drop bombs, and that in some ways is going to change the equation in Syria?
Well, our allies think that it will make a difference, which is why they've made a direct appeal to us. I mean, the judgment that I've made is that there is a very real threat that Daesh pose to our country. Let's not forget what happened in Paris. Let's not forget what happened, 30 British holidaymakers murdered on the beaches of North Africa. And we know that there have been 7 foiled terror plots on mainland UK this year alone. So we've got to find a way in which we can keep our country safe. And the Prime Minister's made a case, and people rightly have looked very carefully at the detail of that. But in the end, we have to make the judgment about what we think is the right thing to do to protect our people.
Keeping our people safe.
The way to keep our people safe is to work with the regional powers, stop the money and the troops and the oil sales. Negotiate a truce in Syria. The idea that 6 bombers are going to keep British people safe, it is just so sad. Within 48 hours of this vote, if it goes the wrong way, there will be bombers screaming to bomb Raqqa, and there will be thousands of civilians.
I agree with Diane. There are a number of other things that need to be done, which is why I've said any military action needs to be framed within a wider strategy. But what I'm not clear about is what is the mechanism by which we can prevent those in Raqqa, those Daesh fanatics, plotting against people in this country, because we know that's happening.
Dan, these atrocities in Paris and so on, they are actually delivered very often by nationals of the country. This isn't the Second World War. You don't destroy their HQ and nothing happens. This is a 21st century terrorism which happens on the internet. Bombing for the sake of it is just tragic.
Well, surely this is the point, that it goes right to the heart of this issue, which is the inspiration of these people, which is a radical Wahhabi madness driven by obsessions which then fuel people in other countries. That's true. But how do you deal with that by bombing?
Well, look, I'm in the very fortunate position. I've attended the National Security Council, so I have a very comprehensive understanding of the nature of the threat that we face. And one of the ways in which we can prevent people from planning these attacks that we saw in Paris and in North Africa, 7 foiled terror attacks on the mainland UK, we do have to target the command and control structures in Raqqa. And nobody who's opposing the motion tonight has been able to explain to me or convince me that there is another way of doing that other than using military force.
If Dan is right, and they could pinpoint command and control targets, would that not be worth doing?
It's a nonsense. First of all, ISIS has many more command and control hubs than Raqqa. Secondly, they are hiding themselves in the communities, and so that there will be the type of casualties which turn the Muslim world against us. And thirdly, you do not combat internet jihadism by bombing. That is analog thinking for an internet age.
Analog thinking.
We know that there is a direct threat from Islamic State to our country. Nobody is suggesting that military action alone will solve this problem, which is why it's very clear it needs to be framed within a wider strategy.
But it's not even military action alone, it's aerial bombardment alone.
Yes. Look at the aerial attacks that have been taking place in Iraq. So we've had over 325 attacks in Iraq. There have been no civilian casualties that have taken place.
You're telling me there won't be any civilian casualties going forward?
Dan Jarvis, we have had 6 months of solid American bombing, 15,000 bomb runs. What have they delivered?
Well, they've delivered an undermining of their capability
Is this why
within
they
Raqqa.
captured Palmyra? Is this why they're stronger than ever?
Okay.
Is that what the bombing delivered?
What you haven't been able to explain is what is the mechanism by which we can stop Daesh plotting to conduct attacks in Europe?
I'll tell you again. I'll tell you again, Dan. You negotiate an end to the
negotiate
Syrian,
with Daesh.
No, you negotiate an end to the Syrian civil war, which has created the space in which ISIS has flourished, and you get the regional powers to step up.
Well,
we know.
we haven't mentioned Assad or his 80,000 troops. What are you going to do about them?
Well, this is one of the things that disturbs me. Are we going to find ourselves fighting on the same side as Assad? People like Dan can't explain that.
We're going to have to pause there. Thank you both very warmly, Dan Jarvis and Diane Abbott.